Today we're going to briefly cover some of the things that we've talked about before, but what we're going to focus on, next slide please, is two approaches to dealing with, and this applies for both Laura and I, by the way, is that we have no relationship financially to the program. And our objectives today are to implement and sustain a collaborative rather than a directive treatment approach in the management of suicidality. That's the collaborative assessment and management of suicidality model that I'm going to talk about. Utilize the suicide status form, which is also linked to the CAMS model. And then Laura is going to talk about using the strategies of cognitive behavioral therapy, suicide prevention, especially the relapse prevention protocol, to enhance safety in suicidal youth. Next slide. So what Laura and I are going to be talking about, next slide. This is about the organization that Laura and I are part of, is these two models of looking specifically as suicidality as the main thing that you focus on. So unlike a lot of models of treatment of people who are suicidal, when we're looking at suicidality as part of depression or substance abuse disorder or bipolar disorder or personality disorder or other kinds of co-occurring problems, this is looking at specifically the intent, plans, attempts, and desire to kill yourself and how to create a safe situation for those people. And the two models that are evidence-based in adolescence, in a great deal of studies looking at longitudinal results, is the collaborative assessment and management of suicidality model, which I'm now going to be talking about, and CBT-SP, which Laura will be talking about. So there's a lot of common factors. So when I talk about CAMS, I'm going to highlight a lot of the things that are in common with CBT so that when Laura picks up, she'll focus on the things that are particular to CBT itself. So with CAMS, the basic belief is that suicidal thoughts and behaviors are an effort to cope or problem solve with looking at how to deal with the incredible pain and misery and suffering that people have that drive them to want to die and to kill themselves. And so the idea is that you understand suicidality not as pathology, but as a way of coping with unbelievable stress where people have either exhausted what they usually use to cope with the situation or feel that this is the only answer. And the thing I often compare it to is people who have terminal cancer where they've tried every kind of treatment open to them, including experimental treatment, and they feel that they have no possibility of handling it any other way than by suicide. One thing that makes CAMS very different is, like in its very first term describing it, it's a collaborative approach. It's totally transparent. You work side by side with the youth. Everything that they write, you see. Everything that you write, they see. You brainstorm together about how to deal with the situation, as opposed to that they are passive, quote, patients that accept your expertise and direction. You view them as the expert on their own situation. And furthermore, CAMS encourages the involvement of supports that the youth identifies. That could be a peer, it could be a friend, it could be a family member, anybody that they think would be helpful to them, because the goal is to enhance safety and reasons for living and minimize and reduce reasons for dying and risky behavior. Next slide. So again, like I just mentioned, it's a collaborative approach. Empathy with the suicidal wish is understanding the dilemma that they feel that they're in, the hopelessness that they feel, the intense desire to end the suffering that they're undergoing, to clarify this agenda, and again, that all assessments are transparent and interactive. Next slide. So the clinical framework is to look at suicide assessment and risk using the suicide status form, which is again completed jointly by the provider and the youth. And you talk together, you compile this together. We're not going to go into great detail because Laura and I spoke with you at length earlier about safety planning and risk assessment. So we're going to cover the highlights of that. The safety plan, the stabilization plan, includes all the ways that the person can cope on their own, can draw friends in, can help get the support of professionals like all of us. And incorporated in that, once we give them all these tools and they're more optimistic and hopeful about alternatives to killing themselves, we also talk about reducing access to lethal means, which again, Laura and I covered at great length in earlier webinars, which you're welcome to access. Then you focus on very problem-focused behavioral interventions to treat key drivers of suicide. Now, I want to point out that word. We talk about drivers or precipitants or contextual factors. We don't talk about triggers, because the way that people often try to kill themselves and end up dying from that attempt is using firearms. So we don't want to hypnotically repeat the word trigger and trigger and trigger when we're talking to people who are at risk for using a firearm to end their life. Beyond coping, what we always want to focus on is that we want to foster a life worth living. And like I like to mention in all these kinds of discussions about any form of risky behavior, the whole goal is not to reduce symptoms, not to reduce suicide. What we're really looking at is fostering a hopeful, meaningful life where people restore a sense of value, meaning, purpose, and connection to their life. Next slide. So I'm going to skip this one, but for those of you who are psychologists who are familiar with Steve Finn's model of therapeutic assessment, this information is available to you. And I always like to say, as does Laura, that we create these presentations that are very sort of text and information heavy as resources for you. If we were seeing you live, we would have nice flashy infographics and a few bullet points, but we don't do that here. So realize you don't have to furiously take notes, and Laura and I are going to just highlight the key points when we're talking today, but this is all going to be available to you in the PDF. We also sent you a PDF of the suicide status form, which we're going to be talking about. And Laura and I are totally available to you through our emails to give you any more information that you have or further case consultation, whatever may be of help to you. Next slide. So how does CAMS address suicidality? A collaborative approach, concrete, simple steps that that person can do on their own or with the help of friends, professional support, peers, etc., to ensure their safety in the near term. And then interventions to address long-term vulnerability, these drivers, these factors that push them into suicidality. Next slide. So the suicide status form is basically a form that incorporates risk assessment, treatment planning, and a form of tracking progress and outcomes. Next slide. So Laura just let you know that she uploaded the suicide status form so that you can see that. I'm not going to go into the details of that because, again, you're going to get that information through the PDF. Next slide. So you can see that there's a sketch for the initial session. Next. The stabilization plan or the safety plan. Next. And then you also can use it to monitor progress. And again, this is a mutual conversation. The conventional model, which CBT sort of exemplifies, is looking often at suicide as a symptom, for instance, of depression. So it's part and parcel of typical symptoms and signs of depression. You can see that the graphic that you see, the therapist is one up to the patient who is labeled as a patient. So they're a passive sort of recipient of the therapist's directives and focus. So the therapist intuits and by history describes what the problem is to the patient, prescribes the treatment to the patient, and then gives them information about, here's the framework, here's what I think is best for you. And they prescribe that model and then coach the patient on how to follow those steps. Next slide. Next slide. So here again is text that summarizes what I just said. Next. So the problems with this is that oftentimes the therapist's behaviors may be associated with feeling that unnecessary hospitalizations are taking place. There's implicit messages and explicit messages to the patient that the therapist wants out of the therapeutic relationship. That's especially the case when there's an emphasis on what are called no suicide contracts. I hope all of you know that that is totally counterproductive. My favorite way of explaining that is thinking about a medical illness. It's like if somebody came in with asthma and you said, I'm not going to treat you if you wheeze again, or promise that you're never going to have an asthma attack. Or if you're a diabetic, say, you'll never need insulin again and your sugars will be normal, otherwise I won't treat you. It's totally antithetical to a caring, providing kind of approach. So what we want to look at is that we also encourage that the person should feel an understanding and an empathy for the fact that they're having suicidal urges, that we understand what drives them to feel so desperate, and that we're not communicating that something is deeply wrong with them for having these death-related thoughts, but it's an understandable, if not desperate, kind of way of dealing with overwhelming stress. Next slide. So the collaborative approach, you're literally side by side. You see suicidality as something that is related to the emotional, psychological pain they're feeling, stress, agitation, hopelessness, and self-hate. Now, why these 5 factors? In hundreds of thousands of youth, over numerous studies in different parts of the world, conducted by a variety of studies, what we find is that by self-report, youth say these 5 clusters of problems are the issues that drive them to feeling relatively hopeless about moving on in life. And so what we want to do is look at not what we see as risk or protective factors for them, but what they see as warning signs for them that they're in trouble, that they're suffering, and that they feel hopeless. And what we're trying to do is, again, shore up the reasons for living that they already had that may be tenuous because of the challenges of these issues, and diminish reasons for dying. Next slide. Next slide. So we've talked about expressing the empathy for the suicidal wish. What that means is that the patient is the only one who can determine the extent to which suicide remains an option over time. So it's best to acknowledge that suicidal coping may be perceived as a means for dealing with this profound suffering. as opposed to something that is out of bounds, pathological, and needs to be extinguished. It's very similar to what we've learned about people who cut when they are doing non-suicidal self-harm. We've learned that a lot of people who, especially those people who are severely traumatized, find cutting a way of taking control over their body when they feel that they've lost control, and grounding themselves when they feel that they're depersonalizing, derealizing, or dissociating. So we're understanding that for them, suicidality is a way of coping as opposed to an expression of deep pathology. And so we're not saying that that's the right thing to do, but we're saying that we understand their dilemma, and what we're looking for is developing alternative ways of coping. It's one form of coping. We're looking at healthier coping. So in other words, we say, I hear where you're coming from. This doesn't scare me. I believe I can help you find alternatives to getting your legitimate needs met. Now, this last part is really important. In a lot of times, often in schools, if somebody expresses even a vague flirtation with thinking about not wanting to move on, not even concrete feelings of death or dying or suicide, they're often referred emergently to urgent care or emergency rooms for an assessment of suicidality. So that's giving a message that even the slightest tinge of suicidality, even the slightest tinge of it, is really problematic. So what we want to say is, we understand the suffering that they're going through, and we have alternatives that we can offer to them. Next slide. So what we're doing is focusing on the issues directly related to the suicidal thoughts and behaviors. Next slide. Next slide. So the stabilization planning is basically the safety plan. So what we're looking at is, like with safety planning, starting with those warning signs that tell them that they're in trouble. That could be that they're losing support with people, that they are having difficulty with sleep, with appetite, that the things that normally gave them pleasure do not, that they're feeling unsupported, rejected, abandoned by those people around them. Whatever they might feel is what we look at, not sort of arbitrarily our idea of, are they showing signs of, quote, clinical depression? It's what the warning signs are to them. The plan should be accessible to them and their support network. So we look at ways of taking that with them, whether on smartphone applications or cards in their wallet, and that they share it with the people in real life. Like any kind of time-effective treatment, what we're looking at is what happens in real life is far more important than anything that we do in their office. Next slide. So the components are, again, identifying the warning signs, thoughts, emotions, behaviors, themes that increase feelings of suicidality, that contribute to that person's suicidality. And oftentimes it might be very vague, like, I can't live with this anymore. I can't face this anymore. I don't want to wake up tomorrow and deal with this. It might not be very specific and concrete things of, I need to die, I need to kill myself. Brainstorm with them. So it's a collaborative problem solving together. Not that you prescribe what you intuit would be helpful to them. You brainstorm together, that you give them a whole series of options and ask them to generate their own, as opposed to, again, deciding what to do for them. You help them identify support people, friends and acquaintances who will help distract them and comfort them, or advise them, or counsel them, support their healthy behavior, minimize their self-endangering risky behavior. And then you also give them all sorts of information about how all of us are available, about hotlines, the New Mexico Crisis Access Line, the Agora line, all the possibilities. And then you also talk at that point in time, after you've given them all these resources, so they're hopefully more hopeful about their situation, then you talk about reducing access to lethal means. And as we've talked about in our previous meetings together, a lot of times that's because what we understand is that suicidality is often intense and intensely brief. Typically with youth, it's because of something that happens with people around them. They're in conflict, they feel that they're discounted, abandoned, rejected, hurt, not taken care of. And so at that moment, they feel alone, worthless, helpless, hopeless. And if something like a loaded gun, or they're unsupervised and they can go off and hang themselves or suffocate themselves or jump from a high place, those are the most lethal forms of suicide attempts. Interestingly enough, when we look at statistics, we've often been taught to look so much at overdoses. When people take an overdose, 1% to 2% of those people who take an overdose die from the overdose. Less than 1% die from cutting themselves. But 90% plus of people who use a firearm die if they use a loaded gun. About 2/3 of people who hang themselves die from the hanging, especially if they're not discovered for a period of time. So if in the moment, and that moment may last for minutes or for hours, rarely longer than a day, if they don't have that lethal means available, even if they're intensely suicidal, they have no way to die from that suicidality. And the other part of the statistics that help us understand this better is that those people who survive a near lethal attempt, jumping off a bridge, taking a potentially lethal overdose, and then waking up in the intensive care unit, less than 5% of those survivors never make a serious life-threatening suicide attempt in their entire lifetime. And people have been studied as long as 2 decades after a significantly life-threatening suicide attempt, and in those 20 years plus, do not make another lethal attempt. So that's why we emphasize, like you can hear me right now, talking about how preventing and reducing access to lethal means is so critical. Then we talk about how likely are they to use this safety plan and what are the obstacles that would get in their way. And we always end with, and the suicide status form that you'll see, the very last point after you do this is, now that we've had our talk today, what is the main reason why I want to go on living? What is my reasons for living that I've identified? And it could be, I don't want to leave my friends and family. Who's going to take care of my dog or my younger sister? Or I don't want to disappoint people. Or now that I've talked to you, I realize I do have a lot to live for. I do have a lot that I offer other people. Next slide. So the safety planning is key. I just went through that. As you can see, it's essential in both CAMS and CBT-SP. So Laura is just going to briefly mention this when I turn it over to her next. And I went through those categories: warning signs on my own, with a friend, tell someone, which is asking for advice, asking for help from a professional, reducing access to lethal means, the likelihood of using the plan, and then ending up on reasons for living. Next slide. And there is a reasons for living inventory that was developed by the CAMS team. David Jobs, who created this therapy, was part of the DBT team at the University of Washington, developed DBT for adolescents, and CAMS is an offshoot of DBT, which focuses again on suicidality per se, unlike DBT, which, like you know, focuses often on long-standing personality disorders and severe mental illness. Next slide. So reasons for living versus reasons for dying. And we always start with reasons for living first. We rank them, and then we talk about how does that affect reasons for dying. Next slide. So the issue about the stabilization plan versus the treatment plan is that the idea is we're giving the person all these tools to look at when they feel hopeless, how to seek safety. Next slide. And the other thing that I wanted to emphasize is that we're looking at, pardon for the phone call there. What we're looking at is the CLAMS Clinician as a case manager, which means that you are solely focused with that youth on the suicidality. If they need medical treatment because they have some kind of chronic physical disorder, if they need substance abuse treatment or specialized treatment for a major depressive disorder or a mood disorder, then you link to those people who are providing that care, and you try to create a system of care where everybody's aligned in this idea of enhancing safety, enhancing reasons for living, and minimizing and reducing risky behavior and reasons for dying. So you don't work in isolation of all the other treatment, but you approach that as a case manager who's trying to tie all the loose ends together. And you're encouraging everyone else to, in some ways, go along with you to view the adolescent, the youth, as a collaborator, as an equal partner in their own treatment, as opposed to a one-up, one-down, directive, prescriptive kind of model that a lot of the therapies that people do incorporate. Next slide. So that's the summary: risk level, identifying the drivers, safety planning, treatment planning, problem solving, looking at alternative ways of coping, and dealing with those clusters of psychological pain, feeling stressed, not in the sense of a stress disorder, but feeling overwhelmed and agitated like they have to do something right now, hopelessness, worthlessness, and self-hate. Next slide. So we always end all of our treatments for suicidality on emphasizing a life worth living. Developing a meaningful life is not just relapse prevention. It's coping and problem solving techniques, etc. Maureen, let's see, what did, somebody typed in something. What was the other word? Oh, you used with drivers rather than the word trigger. So you can talk about precipitants or things that happen to you that you connect to, things that you associate with, all those kinds of things. Yes, thanks. I really appreciate Maureen saying, I would be so glad for us to get away from that word too. Excellent. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. Now we're going to have Laura take over and talk about cognitive therapy for suicide prevention. Thanks, Laura.
Thank you, Avi. So I'll touch on cognitive therapy for suicide prevention. This is a model that is based on cognitive behavioral therapy. It was specific for suicide prevention. Amy Wenzel is the author of a book that I'm using for this, along with Aaron Beck and Brown. So suicide in this model is seen as a problematic coping behavior. It's not necessarily a symptom of a disorder with this particular model. And so the way this model can be used is that it can be done in collaboration. It's preferred that it's done in collaboration with other models, more of a treatment team approach, so that if somebody is receiving services for cognitive therapy for suicide prevention, and at the same time, they have a challenge with substance abuse. They could be seeing a substance abuse counselor at the same time. And the idea is that you're working together with releases of information and the knowledge and collaboration with the client, that you're all working together on these things. The piece about CBT for suicide prevention that I want to make you aware of is developed as a brief therapy. It's generally 10 weeks. Again, with brief therapies, that's not hardcore written in stone, but the idea is that it is 10 to 12 weeks generally, and that we later on might give booster sessions or focus on other kinds of issues, but we're going to do just 10 to 12 weeks of this particular model. Next slide, and we're focusing really on suicidal behaviors and thoughts. So these cognitions and thoughts are central to suicidal acts, and it's a predictor to suicide. So when we're assessing someone, we want to always talk about or ask, when was suicide ideation, when were you most suicidal? When was the suicide ideation the highest for you, or most frequent? We're always looking at frequency, intensity, and duration. And the higher of those, the more probability of a suicide attempt. The other thing I want to say about this model is that this is not only for individuals who have attempted suicide, this is for anyone who is having suicidal thoughts. So sometimes people ask that question. I wanted to clarify that. So we're always assessing for thoughts of hopelessness. This is similar to the CAMS model we talked about earlier when Avi mentioned hopelessness as being one of those drivers. And we know that impulsivity can be a vulnerability for some people who are suicidal, particularly with youth, when we just know in general that youth can tend to be very impulsive in nature. Next slide, please. So in this model, there are 3 phases of treatment. The early phase is generally in the first week or 2, and that's good assessment. We're always doing safety planning. Avi spoke about that, so safety planning is important. We want to revisit safety plans every time we see somebody. And then a case conceptualization. The intermediate phase, I call this the meat of the model. This is really the meat, the 3rd to 8th, 9th session. We're doing a lot of psychosocial education, focusing on problems that are related to the crisis, suicidal crisis, thoughts, feelings, and then developing a lot of skill building on coping around these thoughts. And then the last phase is the relapse prevention technique, which is something unique that I'll talk about also. Next slide, please. So under the case conceptualization, this is the first phase. This is, when most people come in for an assessment, we do the gather information, the first phase, a good psychosocial assessment. Then in this, we want to look more specifically about assessing suicide risk factors, protective factors, those types of things. And then we go into a narrative about the suicidal act and what actually happened if they either had an attempt or they're strongly thinking about it. So let's go into the next slide, please. And so the narrative is just asking what happened. Now, when I work with psychiatrists, and I've worked with another, Dr. Breider, for a number of years, oftentimes when people come into the hospital, this conversation has happened. And so we're going to re-ask it, though, in an outpatient setting. What were the thoughts you had? What were you feeling? What did you do? Were there thoughts and plans? And then was there an actual attempt? So that's part of the initial assessment in this particular model. Next slide. And then we're going to, in this next piece of treatment, we're really focusing now on practicing skills so we can help somebody decrease their ideations and behaviors, identify what are the problems or the drivers that we spoke about, or challenges, or whatever words that feel good for you, and staying away from the word trigger. I really like that too. So I often find myself using the word challenge. It just works for me. But what led up to that? And then increasing skills so that should there be a future crisis, they have some coping strategies, thinking and identifying thoughts and behaviors, and always assessing and modifying the safety plan. The safety plan shouldn't just be something that we write and stick on the chart. It should be something we're always checking in with and making sure that it's being utilized. Next slide, please. So I just did a few things I wanted to just make you aware of if you've never done this before. Clinically, a lot of people really like this as an intervention. I call it a hope box or hope kit. You can see in the pictures, there's one that was decorated by somebody. These are things that you can ask someone to create at home, start it in the office, maybe they take it with them. And it's just full of things. This is like the reasons for living box, would be another word for it. So it could be notes from somebody, spiritual quotes, cartoons, things that make them laugh, photographs, anything that helps them to pull back to why am I here? What is my reason for living? And this is a really nice tool. So, and I've had kids that will decorate it when we do it in the office, you know, with colors and paints, and I've done that in the past, and people really enjoy that. Next slide. And then again, with cognitive strategies, we want to always be thinking about, and I'll talk a minute about coping cards, identifying reasons for living. We want to work on prevention for, we call in CBTs for suicide prevention, in CBT they call it attentional fixations. And so when someone is fixated on something, we want to help break that cycle and help give alternatives for those thoughts. And then decreasing beliefs about unbearability. So it's a lot of, you know, really working with a CBT model in terms of alternative thoughts. And so let's look at the next slide. I think the next slide is tracking automatic thoughts. And so this is also a helpful tool, the situation, and you can go online and find these if you just Google sheets for automatic thoughts. And again, I'm not going to go into this because you can access it, but we're looking for alternative responses and a shift in affect that somebody would experience when they say these different things to themselves. Next slide, please. And then coping cards for a lot of people who don't use CBT regularly, this is something new. And so coping cards are strategies that can be used where you can, in therapy, you can identify what are the thoughts that are problematic and help somebody, again, collaboratively thinking about what's the alternative response. So if the thought is, I don't think I can take this anymore, the alternative response can be, I can focus on how I feel, or I can call a friend, or I can walk or meditate. So these are just strategies you can use in this particular model with CBT. Okay, next slide, please. And then again, we're always increasing skills, helping people with behavioral strategies, teaching soothing strategies, looking at ways to reduce impulsivity, listing pros and cons. This is really helpful with youth about listing pros and cons if they were to do certain things, because we just need to bring it to the attention, because oftentimes when things are done impulsively, they're not always thinking very clearly, so it's done quickly. So we want to help slow things down a little bit, reviewing alternatives to these kinds of things. And again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I just want to point this out as a skill. Next slide, please. And then in the last phase of CBT for suicide prevention is generally done towards the end. And so this is like session 9, 10, 11, 12. Again, we don't go into this later session until somebody has become quite skilled in learning these different strategies we talked about. So identifying the times when they were most suicidal, identifying those problem thoughts that they might have, or those thoughts that might lead to thinking about suicide, that increased risk. All of these things, we want to make sure they have a really good foundation in developing some skills and have identified very clearly reasons for living. Because the next step is this later phase around relapse prevention. So let's go to the next slide and I'll talk about this for a bit. So relapse prevention is really interesting because it's really using a guided imagery exercise with clients about whatever their suicidal crisis was. And what we're doing is we're basically using this as a rehearsal if there should be a future suicidal crisis, so that they can apply all of these coping skills that they've had. And also, we want to help people complete this phase of relapse prevention before they successfully end the therapy. We want them to be able to really walk through this process, identify what they could use should they have a future time where they have lots of thoughts about suicide that could put them at risk. And we want them to really understand how they can put these tools into place before we end this treatment with them. Next slide, please. So there's basically a protocol that we would go through with somebody, is helping someone understand why we're doing this, helping them that we want to get agreement that we're going to talk about what happened, that this could bring up some negative emotions for them. By this point, we should have a pretty clear understanding that people have very good strategies for coping with these things. We don't want to push somebody into this protocol of relapse prevention until we feel like they're very stable and understanding all of the skills that we talked about before. And of course, we're always obtaining clients' consent. And the next slide, please. So the way this would work is that for people, again, this is interesting, and I think I've learned this a lot from my Native American friends and colleagues. In some traditional Native American Indian cultures, it is not okay for them to go back and talk about times where they have attempted suicide, or to talk about things that have happened in the past. That within their culture is that's not okay. And so what we have done in my conversations with them is we don't talk about the past then. What we do is reframe it in a way that they would talk about and think about if this should happen in the future, if their client should begin to have a lot of ideation or thoughts about suicide or feeling like they didn't want to live anymore, then we would help them practice how do you introduce these coping strategies so that you can stabilize, use the safety plan, those kinds of things. We don't talk about the past. So that's important to know if you're working with American Indian populations. So what we're doing is we want to help somebody produce an image, if not teach them how to use guided imagery, and to think about what happened at the time of the crisis or the attempt. And we're asking them to describe it in the present tense. So we're not framing it in past tense, but in present tense, to talk through the events that led up to the crisis. And we're focusing on thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and those circumstances surrounding that. Next slide. And then what we want to do is we want to review in the present tense with all of these events and ask them to think about what are these coping strategies that you've learned, what might you do differently, what might you do if you had these thoughts, what kind of coping skills or strategies would you use to interrupt that thought process, what would you do behaviorally, take a walk, take a bath, those kinds of things. Next slide, please. And then we want to review a future, if there should be a future suicidal crisis. So we want to ask them to, now we're imaging again and describe events that could lead to a future suicidal crisis. So for an example, if somebody had a suicidal crisis and maybe it was over a breakup, they were dating somebody and it ended very badly and there was a breakup, and this youth had never been through this before, and they felt very distraught and upset. And so we walked them through what happened with a crisis. We might talk about what might happen again in a future suicidal crisis, or just in a future crisis, because we know in relationships that there oftentimes are people who come and go in our lives, our breakups, those kinds of things. And so should that happen, or you lose a friend, what might you do if you begin to have those upsetting thoughts about, oh, I'm not ever going to be in a relationship again, I'm not worth loving, those kinds of thoughts that someone might have, and help prompt them again around what might they use in terms of their coping strategies and that type of thing. Okay, let's go forward, please. Next slide. And again, we always want to debrief and follow up with them afterwards and make sure that people feel safe through this process. Next slide, please. So again, I went through that fairly quickly. I think with CBT, I think that it's a really great model. And again, for those of you who are interested in learning more about it, the Amy Wenzel book is a very good book. And Avi, I know we're running up on time, but I love this, the installation of hope. I love this drawing. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings a tune without the words and never stops at all, by Emily Dickinson. It's a beautiful poem, and we always, always, always want to instill hope when we're working with people. One of the things that I often do is I tell people, until you're feeling more hopeful, I will hold your hope for you. Then when you're ready, we'll share it together. So we always have to be instilling hope in those that we're working with. Next slide. We have a couple of apps I just wanted to mention. If you're not familiar with these, and again, we always talk about things that are free. This is called Safety Plan to Go app, and you can download this and find it. So it's in your slides. I don't need to go into it, but it has the 5 steps of a safety plan. And so you can have a session with your client if they have a phone, if they'd like to download it, and they can actually put the safety plan in the phone. And I mean, a lot of youth, I think, would rather, pardon me, look at a phone than a piece of paper. Next slide, please. And this is also a really nice app. This is called MY3 for safety planning. You can see on the left, there's what you can do is upload somebody's photograph, and when you touch their face on the phone, it will dial their number. And then it has underneath it national hotlines, and then it has call 911, but it also has a safety plan app within that phone, which is within this phone app, which is great. And then one more, next slide. This virtual hope box is a really great app. It has all kinds of coping strategies. It has quotations. Sometimes I look on this app and I'll find quotes and I'll text them to my boys. They're just very nice, positive apps, or quotations, I mean, that are within this app. There's also a piece in here around guided imagery. So it will do a guided meditation or imagery. So it's a very nice coping app. And then there's just one more, I think, next slide, please. And this is an app developed by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. They call it Suicide Safe. And this is more for providers. It's got a lot of information in it. I've not even gone through it all. It's very loaded with information. It has providers in different parts of the country if someone's moving. How do you talk to somebody about suicide? Those kinds of things. So I would encourage you all to take a look at these apps. And then just one more slide. Next, Felicia. And again, these, Avi mentioned these, but these are some of the lines that we have in our state. We have New Mexico Crisis and Access Line. They have a peer-to-peer warm line. The Crisis and Access Line is available 24 hours a day. And they just recently implemented this healthcare worker and first responder support line, which is really great. And then we always have the National Prevention Lifeline that people can call as well. I think that's it, Avi.
Sounds good. Again, we know that we hit the high points for this, but this is just to alert you that there are forms of treatment that you can engage people in a very short term, just focused on the suicidality in and of itself. And as you can see, safety planning is key to all the things that we do. So what we hope is that you'll have the tools to do assessments for risk, help determine whether or not somebody needs more intensive kind of care. And if you don't offer these kinds of services, you'll at least know when they're suitable and when they're not, and when they might benefit somebody and when they might not, and then know how to make the appropriate referrals. And if you're looking for resources in that area, please reach out to Laura and to me.